So we're going to look at C.S. Lewis's Perelandra once again, and I spent a fair bit of time on the opening chapters last time, which I sort of regret, not because it wasn't worth doing, but because there's just so much to get through. But I really wanted to show you what Lewis was trying to do, I think, in the opening chapters in terms of trying to set a framework by which the reader could enter into the wardrobe, as it were. If you look at the Narnia stories, that use of a device to bring you into another world and to think in a different dimension, different way. I think Lewis is trying to do the same thing here through a different means, and he's done it this way by having a character represent, although he's called C.S. Lewis, he represents a very naive person who looks at the world through the lens of the Enlightenment, more or less, and accepts its categories of understanding in accordance with things like physical and spiritual and so forth. And he speaks to Ransom, who can no longer be so naive because he has been involved in this interplanetary fictional endeavor and has come back changed. He's not in any doubt now of the fact that there are spiritual beings, Eldila, and that there is a battle between good and evil involved in the cosmos, of which he was oblivious before. But now not only does he know that it exists, but also that he has been drawn into it by Mal-Eldil. And so there's an orchestration of a plot that is made plain to us, and at the same time, as the reader, we're in the position of C.S. Lewis here, and he's wanting us to think about things in a different way. So in Narnia, Aslan speaks to the children as having to go further up and further in. Here it is sort of similar. There's a further in, there's an inward awareness that he is drawing our attention to, but also an upward in the sense that it is orchestrated from on high by Mal-Eldil, and that framework, that spiritual framework, is one that he's trying to get us to think in accordance with. And he talks about this repeatedly in his fiction, and it struck me as I was preparing. He does it in, here it is, find my notes here, in his preface to the Screwtape Letters. Now, I don't know if you've read that or not. I didn't read it in the other class, but I know Dr. Davis, I think, dealt with it. Did he deal with it in his C.S. Lewis course, or did he not? I can't recall. No? You may not even know. I don't think he did either. Okay. So in that case, in the preface to the Screwtape Letters, which is letters from a senior devil to a junior devil, he is trying to win people over to diabolical ways of thinking, and the best way to do it is to make them not think that there are spiritual realities, like just to deny that they exist. If you let them do so, then you're in serious trouble. And so here's how he begins with the preface. Lewis says, "I have no intention of explaining how the correspondence which I now offer to the public fell into my hands. And then there are two equal and opposite errors into which our race can fall about the devils. One is to disbelieve in their existence. The other is to believe and to feel an excessive and unhealthy interest in them. They themselves are equally pleased by both errors, and hail a materialist or a magician with the same delight. The sort of script which is used in this book can be very easily obtained by anyone who has once learned the knack, but disposed or excitable people who might make a bad use of it shall not learn it from me. Readers are advised to remember that the devil is a liar. Not everything that Screwtape says should be assumed to be true, even from his own angle. In the same way, Milton's Satan, I said the same thing. I have made no attempt to identify any of the human beings mentioned in the letters, but I think it is very unlikely that the portraits, say, of Friar Spike or the patient's mother, are wholly just. There is wishful thinking in hell as well as on earth." I'll skip over the rest of the introduction there. But what he is saying then is I want to acquaint you with the spiritual reality that exists, but on the other hand, I don't want you to attend to it so closely that you are then consumed with the idea that the realistic way of seeing the world is simply through a spiritual lens. And the reason I say that is because the figure of Weston, who comes forward here, is now convinced that everything is spiritual. And so he, as I said, he gravitates from one extreme, the materialist, to the spiritual, with the same degree of error, just in a different direction. And Lewis wants to address that approach as well. I'll say more about that in a second here. But I do note, and I don't know if I read it in Lewis or some other writer, that when the early Christian creeds were formulated, it never says that I believe in the existence of the devil. It doesn't talk about the devils at all. And at the same time, is aware that they are operative in the world. And the explanation, and I read this, and I can't remember who I read it from, is that while it is orthodox to understand that the devil is at work in the world and that Scripture attests to that, Christians ought not to be attentive to him and his minions so much as the work of God in the world. And to attend too much to the devil is to be drawn down paths that are unhelpful for Christians to consider. So on the one hand, we need to acknowledge his existence, realize that there's a spiritual battle going on at all times, and on the other hand, not be obsessed with what the devil is doing, because that's a path of darkness and despair. And it gives him too much credit also, as if his power were in any way comparable to God's. And I think that's the real problem. And that's the problem modern critics have with reading Milton's Satan. That was the Romantics' problem with reading Milton's Satan. They see him as a character of equal and opposite force to God, if not morally superior, in fact, which is clearly an error even in Milton's text, certainly in terms of Christian theology. So today, because I spent so little time going through it, I'm going to go through it at a great rush, as much of the text as I can, try and hit the main themes. And I'm going to do it just by plucking out some of the passages and then commenting on them. And let me see, where do I want to pick it up? I think I was on chapter 5 last time. 61. So I think it might be, I'll blow that up for you. I might just depart from this text altogether. In fact, I think I'm probably going to do that because it will take me too much time. So I'm just going to use this text and my notes on that. So last time we had the dialogue between the Green Lady and Ransom, the early dialogues before Weston has arrived on the scene. And we see something of the notion of the lady talking about her becoming older. By older, she means wiser. But note that experience and time are in some sense indistinguishable for her. To be a day older is to be wiser, because all of her experience is unfallen, and therefore she's growing and maturing just simply in interacting with the world. Note that for us, becoming a day older does not necessitate becoming wiser. It could be the opposite. We could become more foolish. For her, until she sins, which she's not yet done, to be a day older is of necessity to be wiser. And the fact that he introduces ideas that would never occur to her, like abstracting yourself and seeing yourself as a character in a play, seeing yourself from the outside, this is a novel way of her to think about herself. She thinks of herself as having agency. She thinks of Mel Eldil as having agency, of interacting with her, but she never thinks of looking at herself. It doesn't occur to her. Like we look in a mirror and we see an image of ourselves, that's how she regards looking at herself. It's an odd, abstract way of self-regard. She sees herself in relationship directly to God, which I think Lewis is by implication suggesting is a better way of seeing ourselves. And when I say that, if you look at Colossians 3, there's a really interesting passage here, and it's related to people who are redeemed and not to unfallen beings on the other hand. But still, I think there's something that applies here. Paul writes, if then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. So what this passage suggests is that our life is hidden even from ourselves. It's related to God, but we don't regard life in the way that the materialist does as something that is observable and can be described and can be reduced to mere observation. There's a relatedness and a hiddenness even from us, which totally contradicts the Enlightenment's view of human nature, is that we construct ourselves based on how we see ourselves. But if our life is hidden from us with Christ and God, then we have no way of accessing that hidden life except by virtue of seeing Christ and us in relation to Christ, if that makes any sense. It's a very different way of seeing human identity. And again, in the gender identity politics these days, we talk about constructing our own identity, self-identifying. All of that language of identity is something that we create. This passage in Colossians suggests a different and perhaps superior way of looking at it. I shouldn't say perhaps, a correct way of looking at it. And that, I think, is the way that the lady sees this. So in 60, 59, she says, I was young yesterday. And on page 60, it's chapter 5 actually, goes on to say, what have I got here in my notes? The deep heaven. And in relation to seeing herself, that time can be seen as a condition for self-knowledge, and the self can be seen as an object, and she never thinks of objectifying herself in that way until the point where Ransom introduces this to her. So let me go to the passage if you want. It's actually just before this. I said I wasn't going to do that, so do what you just said, Mass, and stop jumping around. But she also says that Mal-Eldil is speaking to her. The passage on 61. Ransom says, in response to her claim that when I was young, I could imagine no beauty but this of our own world, but he, that is Mal-Eldil, can think of all and all different. So God can conceive of different possible worlds all at one and the same time. And Ransom replies, that is one of the things that is bewildering me, that you are not different. You are shaped like the women of my own kind. I had not expected that. I have been in one other world beside my own, but the creatures there are not at all like you and me. You'd just been to Malacandra. There were Sorns and Hrossa, Fifiltrigi. None have looked anything like a human, yet she does, and he's surprised by this. And her response is, what is bewildering about it? And Ransom, I do not see why different worlds should bring forth like creatures. Do different trees bring forth like fruit? But that other world was older than yours, she said. So she makes a comment about the age of the earth in relation to Malacandra, and Malacandra being older than yours. And then his response is, of course, astonishment. How do you know that? Asked Ransom in amazement. Mal-Eldil is telling me, answered the woman. And as she spoke, the landscape had become different, though with a difference none of the senses could identify. The light was dim, the air gentle, and all Ransom's body was bathed in bliss, but the garden world where he stood seemed to be packed quite full. And as if an unendurable pressure had been laid upon his shoulders, his legs failed him, and he half sank, half fell into a sitting position. He senses the presence of the numinous, of God, of Mal-el-Dil in his presence, and it brings him to his knees. When she talks about the presence there, now the presence is because God is omnipresent, Mal-el-Dil. It would always have been the case, but now he's aware of it, and it brings him to his knees in the same way we read in Scripture. It's his perception of that matter. And again, Lewis is acquainting us with a spiritual reality, which Scripture also speaks of, about the presence of God, falling on your face as though dead, falling to your knees, etc., crying out that God save you from him, more or less, because of his holiness, etc. So an extraordinary reference here. And then even more interesting, the exchange that follows. It all comes into my mind now, she continued. I see the big furry creatures and the white giants. What is it you called them? The Sorns and the blue rivers. Oh, what a strong pleasure it would be to see them with my outward eyes, to touch them. And the stronger because there are no more of that kind to come. It is only in the ancient worlds they linger yet. Why? Said Ransom in a whisper, looking up at her. Note that he's looking up at her from her knees, and she now it's like the Virgin Mary. He sees her not as a primitive, and this we're going to find that Lewis is doing this throughout this. At first, he looks down on her from the intellectual more superiority of the race that we are. And as the story progresses, he starts to see her from a different vantage point, now from his knees, and in awe of her to some degree, her superiority, her spiritual superiority, her vision. And he asked why, and he said, you must know that better than I, she said. For was it not in your own world that all this happened? All what? I thought it would be you who would tell me of it, said the woman, now in her turn bewildered. What are you talking about? Said Ransom. I mean, said she, that in your world, Mal-el-Dil first took himself this form, the form of your race and mine. Reference to the incarnation. You know that? Said Ransom sharply. Those who have had a dream which is very beautiful, but from which nevertheless they have ardently desired to awake, will understand his sensations. Yes, I know that Mal-el-Dil has made me older to that amount since we began speaking. The expression on her face was such as he had never seen and could not steadily look at. The whole of his adventure seemed to be slipping out of his hands. There was a long silence. He stooped down to the water and drank before he spoke again. Oh, my lady, he said, why do you say that such creatures linger only in the ancient worlds? And then she replies, are you so young? She answered, how could they come again? Since our beloved became a man, how could reason in any world take on another form? Now, reason take on another form, and another human form. Now, in reference to the Genesis text, where it talks about God being made in man's image, or man rather being made in God's image, we have a sense that what does the imago Dei actually mean? And I'm going to talk about that on Friday at Bayview Glen and reflecting on the Genesis text, because when you come to the New Testament, there's repeated reference to Christ becoming in the image of God, or being the image of God, rather, not in, but being the image of God, and us being conformed to that image. If you look at 1 Corinthians 15 and so forth, it talks about us being conformed to that image, and human life being conformed to that image. And now he particularly mentions the rational aspect of that. So everything rational, and the Sorns, the Fiffletrigi, whatever, were rational beings, but they were not yet human in their image. But now, after the incarnation, every rational being will be in that same human image, because Christ became who is God's logos, became a human being. So every being henceforth will be human and not some spiritual entity which we might want to attribute to being angelic or something. Like the progressives talk about a spirituality which will lead us to transcend human nature, by which they actually mean we ought to annihilate human nature in its physical form and should show contempt for the human body. That's the new spirituality. It eradicates physical human existence. That will be something that we will see expressed in its fullness in the next novel. But I note that it's a part of the transgender movement. To mutilate the body is something that is not really us, and we can conform to our desires. Same thing in the abortion. That's not a human being, and same thing in euthanasia. This is not a human being. Human being is the spirit of man within that character, and the spirit trumps any physical bodily incarnation. So it's a more spiritual way of looking at the world. So, and this is one of my concerns with the pro-life movement, is that it doesn't recognize that its opponents are actually more spiritual than they. If they claim to be, they think that they're arguing from a superior ground. They're not denying the physical. They're claiming a more spiritual way of looking at themselves. So it's not a concern about the pro-life movement. It's a concern more about the character of those that oppose the idea of humanity having a physical form. And it is in accordance with the Geisteswissenschaften, of course. Anyway, back to this. So reference to the incarnation, and then the great question, how could reason take another form after the incarnation? Yes, because the Logos of God has become incarnate, so this is the fullness and completeness of rational form. And and with the divine Logos then, do you not understand that is all over? Among times, there is a time that turns a corner, and everything this side of it is new. Times do not go backward. So the incarnation transforms history such that now the Logos has completed God's intended purposes, just as it was announced to the woman in Genesis 3:17. So so times don't go backwards. And can one little world like mine be the corner? Asks Ransom. And she says, I do not understand. Corner with us is not the name of a size. It's a turning point. It's the kairos moment, which you hear about. Theologians will talk about chronos versus kairos. There's a sense of time, and then there's a decisive moment when God intervenes in human history and changes everything, and our calendars attest to that as well. And do you, said Ransom with some hesitation, and do you know why he came thus to my world? Because she doesn't. All through this part of the conversation, he found it difficult to look higher than her feet, so that her answer was merely a voice in the air above him. Yes, said the voice, I know the reason, but it is not the reason you know. There was more than one reason, and there is one I know and cannot tell to you, and another that you know and cannot tell to me. And after this, said Ransom, it will all be men? You say that as if you were sorry. I think, said Ransom, I have no more understanding than a beast. I do not well know what I am saying, but I love the furry people whom I met in Malacandra, that old world. Are they to be swept away? Are they only rubbish in the deep heaven? Again, the anthropomorphism of perspective he sees as something that where there's only loss and not gain. And with that, there's a contempt for human nature that's in Ransom's perspective, which is characteristic of the Enlightenment again. There's a hatred of human nature, a desire to circumvent it, get beyond it, and that hence the Gnosticism and spirituality of it. And she says, I don't know what rubbish means, not what you're saying. You do not mean they are worse because they came early in the history and do not come again. They are their own part of the history and not another. We are on the side of the wave and they are on the far side. All is new. Okay, that final phrase, all is new. Jesus says, behold, I'm making all things new. It's the new heavens and the new earth, which are initiated by the incarnation, and the new heavens and the new earth are the kingdom of God, which are being manifested in the world through repentance and faith, conversion, adherence to the will of God, and transformation and the newness, the radical newness that comes with this. So this is not a conservative point of view, which again in Christian circle talks about being a conservative Christian. It's observing the radical nature of the kingdom of God. There's orthodox, but it's not conservative per se. And the problem is that politically we talk about conservative theology, conservative politics, conservative this. Really, it's radical newness. It's an adherence to a different kingdom. But anyway, Lewis, just through this exchange, brings all of that to the fore, and it's transformative then when you get this. And this is before, again, Weston has landed, about how you're going to look at these things going forward. So he's reframing our way of thinking about history, ourselves, time, past generations. All of that is in a science fiction book. So let me go on here to the next chapter, because I'm already taking far too much time on this. So in chapter 6, and the other thing that's of note, in this world there are no Eldila. And that's interesting in itself. And on page 82, that this is noted, that in the worlds created after the incarnation, there are no intermediaries. There are no angels. In our world pre-incarnation, you get lots of references to angels. Do you get them in the New Testament? Yes, you do. Yes and no. Maybe you don't. In the book of Revelation. But do you see the angels being present in the book of Acts? Maybe. Probably. I think so. But anyway, Lewis is suggesting this. Remember, this is the purpose this is a science fiction trilogy, but you don't see it represented much as it appears in Christian iconography at any rate. But this is just for the purposes of the fiction. He thinks that the Eldila will be in this world just like they were in Malacandra, and he says that they're not actually here. And so they're not going to intervene in the same way that they did in Malacandra. And what he realizes is what his purpose then is. So that, he thought, that is why I've been sent here. He failed on Malacandra, and now he is coming here. And it's up to me to do something about it. That is Weston. He's been brought here to foil Weston yet again. He didn't know what it was until Weston lands, and he realizes this. And let me skip on. And certainly it was Weston. And the exchange in chapter 7, very early on, between the two is that Weston pulls out a revolver, and Ransom asks him, are you going to begin in this world also by murdering one of its inhabitants? What are you saying? Asked the lady, pausing and looking back at the two men with a puzzled, tranquil face. Stay where you are, Ransom, said the professor. That native can go where she likes. The sooner, the better. Ransom was about to implore her to make good her escape when he realized that no imploring was needed. He had irrationally supposed that she would understand the situation, but apparently she saw nothing more than two strangers talking about something which she did not at that moment understand. That and her own necessity of leaving the fixed land at once. You and he do not come with me, piebald? She asked. No, said Ransom without turning around. It may be that you and I shall not meet soon again. Greet the king for me if you find him, and speak of me always till Mal-Eldil. I stay here. We shall meet when Mal-Eldil pleases, she answered, or if not, some greater good will come to this. And then there's the exchange between Ransom and Weston. And it's a very, very interesting one at this. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because it clarifies some of the change that's transpired with Weston. I've already alluded to it to some degree. But Weston admits on page 87 that he had made a mistake in his past life. And he's not admitting guilt, by the way. He's made an intellectual mistake. He's made an error, not a moral error, but a cognitive error. And this is interesting. He doesn't acknowledge moral guilt because to do so would be to acknowledge the legitimacy of the Tao, right? In the Abolition of Man, he's going to talk about how the men without chests do not govern themselves by the Tao. In fact, they don't acknowledge the objectivity of the moral law at all, or the law of human nature, however you want to call it. He sees it as a cognitive error that he was willing to exterminate the Malacandrians. A cognitive error, but not a moral error, which shows that he hasn't learned anything. But and they talk about this, and then there's a lot of discussion in page 88 about this, and I want to read some of the language here and make a brief comment. And he accuses Ransom, by the way, of fornication. You were with that green lady, and I know it was going to go on between the two of you. You're both naked. I mean, come on. And then he goes on. And Weston eyes him up, puts the revolver away, and says this: I will begin with a frank admission. You may make what capital of it you please. I shall not be deterred. I deliberately say that I was, in some respects, mistaken, seriously mistaken in my conception of the whole interplanetary problem when I went to Malacandra. Well, that's very handsome. What do you mean? I'll tell you presently. In the meantime, I must get my things ashore. Drags them on shore, and then goes on with a monologue. The tragedy of my life, page 89, he said, and indeed of the modern intellectual world in general, is the rigid specialization of knowledge entailed by the growing complexity of what is known. It is my own share in that tragedy that an early devotion to physics has prevented me from paying any proper attention to biology until I reached the 50s. To do myself justice, I should make it clear that the false humanist ideal of knowledge as an end in itself never appealed to me. I always wanted to know in order to achieve utility. At first, that utility naturally appeared to me in personal form. I wanted scholarships and income, and that generally recognized position in the world without which a man has no leverage. When those were attained, I began to look farther to the utility of the human race. That's how we met him, just like in Frankenstein. He is that sort of figure. He's going beyond and thinking beyond himself, thinking of himself as the federal head of the human race, like a new Adam, as it were. And the utility of the human race, continued Weston, in the long run depends rigidly on the possibility of interplanetary and even intersidereal travel. That problem I solved. The key of human destiny was placed in my hands. It would be unnecessary and painful to us both to remind you how it was wrenched from me in Malacandra by a member of a hostile intelligent species whose existence I admit I had not anticipated. Not hostile exactly, said Ransom, but go on. And then he goes on, and then makes this comment during his convalescence. The traditional, and if I may say so, the humanitarian form in which you advance those objections to killing the Malacandrians had till then concealed from me their true strength. That strength I now began to perceive. I began to see that my own exclusive devotion to human utility was really based on an unconscious dualism. What do you mean? I mean that all my life I've been making a wholly unscientific dichotomy or antithesis between man and nature. Had conceived myself fighting for man against his non-human environment. During my illness, I plunged into biology, and particularly into what might be called biological philosophy, and you could call this emergent evolution, if you will. He doesn't call it that here, but that's what he means by biological philosophy. Hitherto, as a physicist, I've been content to regard life as a subject outside my scope. The conflicting views of those who draw a sharp line between the organic and the inorganic, and those who hold what we call life was inherent in matter, that is, what Lewis will call what? The pantheists. They think that life is in the matter. From the very beginning had not interested me. Now it did. I saw almost at once that I could admit no break, no discontinuity in the unfolding of the cosmic process. And the key lines then, bottom of page 90, I became a convinced believer in emergent evolution. There he is. All is one. The stuff of mind, the unconsciously purpose of dynamism is present from the very beginning. Here he paused. Ransom had heard this sort of thing pretty often before and wondered when his companion was coming to the point. When Weston resumed, it was with an even deeper solemnity of tone, the majestic spectacle of this blind, inarticulate purposiveness thrusting its way upward and ever upward in an endless unity of differentiated achievements toward an ever increasing complexity of organization, towards spontaneity and spirituality, swept away all my old conception of a duty to man as such. Man in himself is nothing. There you go. Compare and contrast that to what the Green Lady has just said about the incarnation and man being the pinnacle of God's creation, himself becoming man, and the reason for life is for God's purposes, but God himself becoming man has redeemed human nature, and life is in conjunction with the furtherance of the goodness of man. Whereas in Ransom or in Weston's, the scientist's perspective, man is nothing. The forward movement of life, capital L now, the growing spirituality is everything. I say that to you quite freely, Ransom, that I should have been wrong in liquidating the Malacandrian. It was mere prejudice. But it's now pure spirituality. And then Ransom responds to this pure spirituality by saying, I don't know much about what people call the religious view of life, said Ransom, wrinkling his brow. You see, I'm a Christian. And what we mean by the Holy Ghost is not a blind, inarticulate purposiveness, but the blind, inarticulate purposiveness is precisely the enlightened position of spirituality. Immanuel Kant calls it purposiveness without purpose, and regularly refers to the spontaneity as the ideal and the purpose of human life is the blind, inarticulate purposiveness without purpose that results in a nihilistic view of the human body, which we see expressed in the Frankenstein story and the contempt for the body. And even in the scientist's creation of life, he despises the life that he created because it is a physical thing. So the panentheism or the pantheism, which is characteristic of Hegel's philosophy, as Lewis says in book 2 of Mere Christianity, go back and read that, read just the beginning there. That's the view that is being expressed here. It's the spiritual, scientific view of human nature, trying to advance the spirit, and it's not the Holy Spirit, because not all spirits are holy. And that's going to be the main point here in differentiation. We have a man fighting for holiness and obedience in the form of Elwin Ransom, and on the other hand, we have a man fighting for spirituality who's willing to kill and is in direct obedience to the devil, as we will soon see. In fact, he will give himself over to do that. And he, in response to Ransom's claim that he's a Christian, Weston says that's just a particular manifestation of spirituality. I have a higher spirituality. Top of 92. That's one of the real weaknesses of organized religion, that adherence to formulae, that failure to recognize one's own friends. God is a spirit, Ransom. Get hold of that. You're familiar with that already. Stick to it. God is a spirit. Well, of course, he says, but what then? Well, what then? Why? Spirit, mind, freedom, spontaneity, that's what I'm talking about. That is the goal towards which the whole cosmic process is moving. The final disengagement of that freedom, that spirituality, is the work to which I dedicated my own life and the life of humanity. The goal, Ransom, the goal, think of it, pure spirit. The final vortex of self-thinking, self-originating activity. Final? Said Ransom. You mean it doesn't yet exist? And then he asked the killer question, is it in any sense at all personal? Is it alive? And then the face of Weston is telling. An indescribable expression passed over Weston's face. He moved a little nearer to Ransom and began speaking in a lower voice. That's what none of them understand, he said. It was such a gangster's or a schoolboy's whisper, and so unlike his usual orotund lecturing style that Ransom for a moment felt a sensation almost of disgust. Yes, said Weston, I couldn't have believed myself till recently. Not a person, of course. Anthropomorphism is one of the childish diseases of popular religion. But the opposite extreme of excessive abstraction is perhaps, in the aggregate, proved more disastrous. Call it a force. Call it a force. A great inscrutable force pouring into us from the dark bases of being, a force that can choose its own instruments. And he claims that he's guided or chosen to be the means of bringing this about. Anyway, so this conflict between the man that holds to the Holy Spirit into a personal form of life and an individual, and the dignity of an individual personal life, on the one hand, Ransom, and on the other, a man devoted to pure spirituality and eliminating all personal individual distinctiveness and even a personal nature for himself, is the new battleground that moves us from the dimension of the Malacandrians to the Perelandrians, and it will also be the way in which we'll talk about this in That Hideous Strength. It's now a spiritual reality, but human nature is the topic of interest. Does that make any sense? Comments or questions here before I move on? I'm going to move on rather swiftly now. But this idea of emergent evolution, which he gets from Henri Bergson, among others. Do I have this? And the Lebensphilosophie. Bergson was aware of the problematic view of life in the materialist conceptions of his contemporaries, and wanted to assert the way in which life can be understood in non-material forms, and says that this is falling wholly outside of their consideration. But what Bergson does, although he is aware of this and very helpful in observing that the ways in which it is more than material being, more than having a brain in a vat, is that he pushes it to the opposite extreme and gives us basically a pantheist view, which Lewis is at pains to say this is as much of an error as the other error, and more dangerous, because now people think they're possessed of a higher cause that is at enmity with an idea of a physical human nature. They're going to be committed to annihilating it for the sake of progress. They want to stop human beings from having babies. They want to produce an idea of carbon footprints destroying the planet. They want to speak of surplus populations like H.G. Wells did, right? Which is still part of the discourse of our day. And again, improving human life by controlling life for the purposes of advancing human life, begging the question of what a human nature is anyway. And the answer to that is it's pure spirituality. Well, when they say pure, it's purified of what? A body. So it's just like the Gnostics in that sense, yet committed to a biological project in a way that was never the case in the ancient world. Anyway, so that, I don't hear any questions here. So he goes with that, and the idea that we are nothing in the face of that, and rather we are the basically a step in the ladder of beings unfolding in the world, and what we will have to do is to move on to the next stage of things, and he even calls it a force. Now, there's a man by the name of Joseph Campbell who writes a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, very much influential on Jordan Peterson, my understanding, who will talk about religion and mythology in archetypal terms, and we'll see the same spiritual expression in different religious and mythological conceptions, and basically it's all reflecting a higher view of spirituality. And there's nothing particularly significant about the Christian version other than it's the best story of the common story. Now, we're going to get into different views of mythology and significance in this, and it's very much popular in our day. But this discussion that Lewis is raising here has been with us since the early 20th century. As I say, Joseph Campbell's popular book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, gets into the same sort of spirituality here. Lewis's response is there are spirits and there are spirits, you know. They're not all the same. Weston can't understand what he's talking about because, again, he doesn't see any significance in the incarnation. And in Christian theology, once again, the fact that Jesus is born of a woman and dies physically and is raised bodily and ascends bodily is Orthodox Christian theology. It's not just he was raised in the consciousness of the apostles and they believed in his message, and so he stayed on in the stories they told about his life and so forth. So it was a story about Christianity, but it wasn't actually a fact that entered human history and transformed human nature, etc. That is removed from the consideration. Anyway, so, and in that sense, we're beyond good and evil. In fact, does he actually talk about that in page 95? But that is effectively it. We're beyond considerations of good and evil. In other words, the Tao is invalid. The way in which Ransom tries to fix his point of view is to appeal to his sense of self-sacrifice as a good, which is exactly the thing that on Malacandra, the Oyarsa said about Weston. There's some good in this being because at least he wants the good of his human race, his own race, to continue. So he's not just self-absorbed, whereas divine, he's just interested in selfish aims. He just wants more gold. I can't do anything with that creature. At least this creature of Weston wants something other than himself. But now Weston has lost that sense because his sense of selflessness is the eradication of every self. And so here's the key exchange where Weston transforms and is basically possessed by the devil, top of 96. Ransom's trying to correct him, and he sees the significance of this exchange. That may be a point of contact. You say it's a total commitment. That is, you're giving up yourself. You're not out for your own advantage. No, wait half a second. This is the point of contact between your morality and mine. We both acknowledge, idiot, said Weston. His voice was almost a howl, and he had risen to his feet. Idiot, he replied. Can you understand nothing? Will you always try to press everything back into the miserable framework of your old jargon about self and self-sacrifice? That is the old accursed dualism in another form. There is no possible distinction in concrete thought between me and the universe. In so far as I am the conductor of the central forward pressure of the universe, I am it. Do you see, you timid, scruple-mongering fool? I am the universe. I, Weston, am your God and your devil. I call that force into me completely. And then at that point, the devil enters him and he becomes possessed. Horrible things began happening. A spasm like that preceding a deadly vomit twisted Weston's face out of recognition. And something like the old Weston appeared, the old Weston staring with eyes of horror and howling, "Ransom, ransom, for Christ's sake, don't let them." And then he spins around like he's been hit by a revolver bolt, falls to the ground, etc. But he actually allows the devil and calls upon the devil to overcome him through the pure spirituality. And at that point, he becomes the unman. So this is his identity going forward, and it's a really interesting formulation on Lewis's part. He calls him the unman because his attempt, his whole endeavor is to deprive us of our humanity, but he himself has deprived himself first of his own humanity by wishing to be annihilated, to be a pure spirit, and failing to distinguish between the God and the devil. It's all just spirituality. God, the devil, two sides of the same coin. There's no distinction. Again, go back to Lewis's Mere Christianity, chapter 2, and he will talk about how pantheism invariably will see good and evil as a matter of perspective. Just depends. You know, we kill a cancer, we kill a man, we call one good, we call the other bad, but really it's just a matter of where you're standing on that. There is no real ultimate good and evil. So as long as we're open to killing, we can kill even the things that we call sacred, because actually it's subjective. There's no Tao that governs these things. So he becomes overcome of the devil, and at that point, the temptation begins. Weston being the clothing for the devil now, just like the serpent was in the original garden narrative. Now we have the form of a man who's been inhabited by the devil, and he will speak to the woman. And of course, Ransom is there as a representative of Adam in the way that he's not in the original story. Remember, there is an Adam in this story. Tor and Tenidril, these two characters, the green man, the king who's absent from her, but Ransom now comes in as the voice of mankind who has learned from the account told in Scripture of the temptation and the fall, and he realizes that what is about to happen is that the lady is going to be brought to ruin by Weston and his spirituality. And Lewis is making a comment then about how the spirituality of his day and the spiritual sciences are actually trying to undermine, if they could, the effect of the incarnation in human history by annihilating the whole human race. That's the gist of this. It's going to become even more apparent in That Hideous Strength. He will talk about that as an explicit aim. We're going to eradicate the human nature. So, and the devil there is, and what Lewis is observing here is, I think, an awareness that the devil can't undo the work of Christ at Calvary. That God has won. The victory is complete in that sense. So he can't undo what God has done. What he can do is get human beings to take their own lives and prevent them from ever having faith in him. So it's phase 2. I failed here. Here's the way I'm going to do it going forward. We're going to go not after theology, as in the early church. We're going to go after anthropology. So modern heresies are anthropological in nature and have the character of Gnosticism, including a spiritual academic elite dedicated to the same goal, a false view of human nature, which they push on us and teach in schools without ever defining what they mean by human or spirit, although it's there in their texts. What they mean by spirit is pure spirit. It's the spontaneity, it's the purposiveness without purpose. It's the non-physical, non-embodied existence that we also see in the transgender movement, where you can create your own identity, because that identity is what your will wants it to be, and what's most important is your will. Because the will is you. And the will can choose to annihilate itself, and that's as good a choice as choosing to be whatever gender you want to be. So again, and the only ethical policy that our contemporaries acknowledge is the right to choose. And it's interesting that those are the terms of the pro-life versus its opponents, pro-life versus pro-choice. And pro-choice means taking life also. It's not every choice, it's that choice. That's the choice that's being lauded. So Lewis is digging into, I think, an issue long before that movement of pro-life would ever begins, but it is in the eugenics of his day, and you can see the implications of it with, I think, a great foresight. Let me move forward here to 103, 104. The temptation of the Green Lady, and the way in which he decides that he is going to tempt her. And the way he's going to tempt her is to get her to do what is forbidden, just like in the Garden of Eden story. But what's forbidden in this world is different than in our world. In our world, it was to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In this world, it's to dwell on the fixed island, the one that doesn't move. All the others are being moved by the waves, and you have no control over it. And Mal-El-Dil sends things to you, and they're all good, but you have no control over what's around you in your environment. But on the fixed land, you could depend on yourself, and you could create a world that was to some degree independent of Mal-El-Dil in that sense, because it has a fixity about it and a certainty. And that's what's forbidden in this world. So the Weston is going to, having realized this, try to encourage her to break the commandment to stay on the fixed island. And the temptation suitably takes place at first in the dark. He hears voices. And again, the physical nature of the temptation is less important than the verbal nature of the temptation. It's an internal temptation. It's about the logos. It's about believing. It's about understanding. And so what Weston is going to do is to start parsing logic with her. He knows that they've been forbidden to stay on, that she's been forbidden to stay on the forbidden land, but she hasn't been forbidden to think about it, has she? She's been forbidden to think about it, so he's pushing the boundaries of consideration, and then to imagine herself in a different form. So conceptualizing logically about things she never would have thought of or considered, and by that means to confuse her about what's right and wrong. So the passage, but you remember we are not to live on the fixed land. No, said Weston, but he has never forbidden you to think about it. Might not that be one of the reasons why you are forbidden to do it? So that you have a might be to think about, to make story about, as we call it, to make up a story. And so he gets her to think like a romantic then, to get you thinking stories. Alternative imaginative realities. That's why the prohibition is there. And then her response, I will think more of this. I will get the king to make me older about it. How greatly I desire to meet this king of yours, but in the matter of stories, he may be no older than you yourself. That saying of yours is like a tree with no fruit. The king is always older than I, and about all things. Weston. But Piebald and I have already made you older about certain matters which the king never mentioned to you. That is the new good which you never expected. You thought you would always learn all things from the king. But now Mal-El-Dil has sent you other men whom it had never entered your mind to think of, and they have told you things the king himself could not know. I begin to see why the king and I were parted at this time, This is a strange and great good he intended for me. And if you refused to learn things from me and kept on saying you would wait and ask the king, would that not be like turning away from the fruit you had found to the fruit you had expected? These are deep questions, stranger. Mal-Eldil is not putting much into my mind about them. Do you not see why? No. Since Piebald and I have come to your world, we have put many things into your mind which Mal-Eldil has not. Do you not see that he is letting go of your hand a little? How could he? He is wherever we go. Yes, but in another way. He is making you older, making you to learn things not straight from him, but by your own meetings with other people and your own questions and thoughts. He is certainly doing that. Yes, he is making you a full woman. Okay, so now, and this is the pivotal point, and this will be the pivotal ethical point. What does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? And the word full as the adjective that qualifies here is going to be the point at which he's going to push. You're a woman, but you're not yet a woman. And the idea of being a human being, again, is dependent on a certain degree of intellectual attainment or moral achievement or imaginative construction, etc. There's where he's going to push the whole argument, just as in our day Peter Singer does when he says that we can commit infanticide because those people are not yet people, because they're not mature. So maturity becomes the new standard of human life. And then it begs the question later on, hold on, there's a deficiency, so that at the end of the day, nobody's mature is the problem. There's always something that you're not quite sufficient in. Anyway, but back to this. He's making you a full woman. For up till now, you were only half made, like the beasts who do nothing of themselves. This time, when you meet the king again, it is you who will have things to tell him. It is you who will be older than he and who will make him older. Mal-Eldil would not make a thing like that happen. It would be like a fruit with no taste, but it would have a taste for him. Do you not think the king must sometimes be tired of being the older? Would he not love you more if you were wiser than he? Is that what you call a poetry, or do you mean that it really is? Note that it's the same justification that Eve uses in Paradise Lost in eating the fruit, that she will be more equal than Adam and he will love her more, because before she was inferior to him, but by eating it, they'll be more equal, by which she means his superior. And that's a vehicle for temptation. Anyway, but back to Lewis Ransom. I mean, a thing that really is. But how could anyone love anything more? It is like saying a thing could be bigger than itself. Because you love it or you don't. You can't love it more. I only meant you could become more like the women of my world. What are they like? They are of a great spirit. They always reach out their hands for the new and unexpected good, and see that it is good long before the men understand it. Their minds run ahead of what Mal-Eldil has told them. They do not need to wait for him to tell them what is good, but know it for themselves as he does. They are, as it were, little Mal-Eldils, and because of their wisdom, their beauty is as much greater than yours as the sweetness of these gourds surpasses the taste of water. And because of their beauty, the love which the men have for them is as much greater than the king's love for you as the naked burning of deep heaven seen from my world is more wonderful than the garden roof of yours. I wish I could see them. I wish you could. So on and on. But key point here. How beautiful is Mal-Eldil, and how wonderful all his works. Perhaps he will bring out of me daughters as much greater than I, as I am greater than the beasts. It will be better than I thought. I had thought I was to be always queen and lady, but I see now that I may be as the Eldila. I may be appointed to cherish when they are small and weak children who will grow up and overtop me and at whose feet I shall fall. I see it is not only questions and thoughts that grow out wider and wider like branches. Joy also widens out and comes where we had never thought. In other words, what does she just exhibit? Humility. Humility. And this silences the devil. I will sleep now, said the other voice. As it said this, it became for the first time unmistakably the voice of Weston, and of Weston disgruntled and snappish. And then the next page he says, Lewis writes, the whole darkness about him rang with victory, because in her humility, she's acted like Christ, and thereby overcome the temptations to be spiritually superior, which is that was the trap that was being laid before her, that she would be superior and would be loved for it, and she's resisted this. She's very happy for her daughters to be her superiors. She doesn't have to rule over them all. It wasn't intrinsic to her identity. And again, she's adhering to a Christ-like ethical stance in her actions. Yes?
It's interesting though, like, even though she's out of posture of humility, Weston's got to think more of an evolutionary mindset.
Yes?
That where she's at now isn't enough, and that must be something greater.
Yes? You're just thinking through it.
I'm working through it more, yeah. But like, I don't know, just in some ways, I think Weston has, while losing this, he has gone a little bit of an edge here.
Weston has an edge. Well, he does have an edge. But what is the edge? What's the nature of the edge?
Well, I think she's no longer then looking at, like, in her understanding, she's no longer looking at creation as good in the sense that there could be more greater on her.
And she's wrong in that?
Not necessarily.
Because he said it can be superior to what it is, and she said, yes, it can. And he assumes that she's going to then jump to the conclusion, and that means that I'm going to go from seeing myself as a physical being obeying a Malel to a spiritual being that can actually even choose to disobey, and that's the thing he wants me to do, to making a conclusion which Weston, the proud being of Satan, did not anticipate, that she will take that conclusion to say, oh, well, then I might become lesser, and that's good. How wonderful, how joyous is it that I should become lesser and that my children should be greater than I. He didn't anticipate that, because it doesn't enter into Satan's mind that to be lower is to be superior, although that is exactly what happens in the incarnation. God decides to condescend to be human. Exhibits the exact opposite moral quality. Defeats pride through humility. Like that's, although he's in very nature God, considered God, equality with God not something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the form of a servant, etc. Right? You know that passage in Colossians, right? Isn't it Colossians? No, it's Philippians 1. Yeah. Philippians 2 even. Yeah, okay. Right. And so that humility, the condescension to become man, is the very thing that God praises and allows him to have the name that is above every name. But it's the humility and that's what she's just exhibited in defeating him, that same sort of humility which is native to her before the fall. She's not yet fallen, so she takes a direction that Satan never imagined, which is an odd thing for him not to have imagined, since that's how he was defeated the first time. But yes.
Just the inability for the green lady to sort of think of herself in abstraction, to objectify herself in that sense, recalls in my mind at this the episode of Paradise Lost where he looks into the water.
Yes. Yeah, just like Narcissus.
Yeah, but unlike Narcissus, she doesn't objectify herself.
Correct.
The truth of beauty as God has created it, but not in relation to herself as an idea.
Right. So Milton's doing the same thing, in other words, showing that an unfallen Eve will not be a megalomaniac or worship herself.
And Satan is trying to get her to think of her own beauty as her own.
Right, in abstraction from him, and as if she possesses it. Right, and that's the whole point that I made in this passage in Colossians 3, verse 1. Your life is hidden with Christ in God. Now, that's not hidden with Christ and God for Eve and before the fall, but now it is, because it has to be, because for us to see it in ourselves with a fallen human nature is to actually fall into the temptation. So you have to actually see yourself in relation to Christ at all points. I think that's the point Lewis is trying to drive here. I'm not going to finish today. I will move on. I'm not done yet, though. So in chapter 1, on page 112, he will talk about the arts as a detachment from God and human creativity in terms of creativity ex nihilo. Just note for yourselves there. And it's a story of branching out, this making of story or poetry about things that might be but are not. If you shrink back from it, are you not drawing back from the fruit that is offered you? So he's trying to encourage her to imagine things that are impossible. And by doing so, by doing what God Malalil wants for her, to actually, again, intellectually conceive of the possibility of doing something that is wrong, because, again, freedom allows her to choose that opportunity. And what we see is this starts to work its way into her and trouble her. It is not from making a story that I shrink back, O stranger, but from this one story that you have put into my head. I can make myself stories about my children or the king. I can make it that the fish fly and that the land beasts swim. But if I try to make the story about living on the fixed island, I do not know how to make it about Mal-Eldil. There's the point. I can make any story I want, but if I make this story, then Mal-Eldil will have to cease to exist. Because he's the one who prohibited it. It's his word that I would have to deny a reality. For if I make it that he has changed his command, that will not go. And if I make it that we are living there against his command, that is like making the sky all black and the water so that we cannot drink it and the air so that we cannot breathe it. But also, I do not see what is the pleasure of trying to make these things, to make you wiser, older, etc. And how can you be certain that it will do that? And he says, well, that's how the women of my world have become so great and beautiful. And then Ransom intervenes. Do not listen to him and send him away. Do not hear what he says. Do not think of it. She turned to Ransom for the first time. There had been some very slight change in her face since he had last seen her. It was not sad nor deeply bewildered, but the hint of something precarious had increased. On the other hand, she was clearly pleased to see him. Sometimes she listened wholly to Ransom, sometimes wholly to the other, but never to both. Why do you start speaking before this man has finished, piebald? How do they do in your world where you are many and more than two must often be together? Do they not talk in turns, or have you an art to understand even when all men speak together? I'm old enough to understand that. I do not want you to hear him at all, said Ransom. He is, and then he hesitated, bad, liar, enemy. None of these words would as yet have any meaning for her, and he's racking his brain. And then piebald Weston interrupts him, and they start. So now the dialogue shifts to an intellectual battle between the two, Weston and Ransom, because Ransom is aware what Weston is trying to do, and what arises out of this, and this is the shocking thing, and it takes him time to realize this, is that the being that inhabits Weston does not sleep, does not need to eat, and he's going to defeat him just as a physical being, because he is needing sleep, he does need rest, he does need food, the other being does not, and he's going to lose this fight over words, and he will have to fight him physically. which he does not want to entertain either. But I'll come to that next time, and I'm going to spend half the class on Perelandra before jumping to that hideous strength. But that will be the battle. I won't spend too much time on it, because this is the significant point here. But then the dialogue between the two and the nature of that battle becomes really interesting. And then we'll move on to what comes out of that battle, because you already know he will kill Weston, and yet the body will come back, because of course it's not Weston only. Anyway, but we'll deal with that next time.